Well, time now for our daily debate. And today we're asking, what do the French want out of Brexit? With Emmanuel Macron meeting the EU's chief negotiator, Michel Barnier, today, we should get some idea of the French president's priorities. Well, joining me now to discuss this are the French-Algerian journalist and broadcaster, Nabila Ramdani, and the former British ambassador to France, Lord Ricketts. Lord Ricketts, I mean, obviously everyone's a partner in the European Union, but national interests come into it as well. What do the French want to gain from Brexit?
Well, I think they'll be fully behind Barnier and the approach that he set out. It's very important for the French and the Germans, I think, that the whole EU sticks together. But of course, France will be looking for its own interests. And we've seen France rolling out the red carpet to try and welcome city bankers to Paris. I mean, they're in a competition with Frankfurt for that. They may not win, but it's natural. They will look for some national advantage out of Brexit.
One gets the sense that the Germans and the Scandinavians will genuinely miss the British, but the French are rather holding the door open.
Yes, and I think this is due to the closeness, in fact, of Michel Barnier and indeed Emmanuel Macron. And in many ways, Michel Barnier is an older version of Emmanuel Macron. He grew up alongside the European Union. He's committed to a project he has huge faith in. And they are essentially both French technocrats who want the very best for France, but also for the European Union. Emmanuel Macron is fiercely pro-EU. He displays an EU flag at any opportunity. And he would want, the best interests for France. And if he has any ideology at all, it's the ideology of a modern European pragmatist. And of course, France would want what it always wants, which is the very best for its national interests. In other words, they would want to maintain a strong working relationship with one of its closest neighbours and indeed allies, while not allowing Britain to, while not rewarding Britain effectively for leaving the bloc.
In France, according to the Financial Times, already a spoke in the wheel of the negotiations, stuck a spoke in the wheel, in as much as it's demanded a recalculation of the Brexit bill to take account of the common agricultural policy.
Yeah, well, France will, of course, be looking out for its own interests, and the CAP has always been a very good deal for France. But I'm not trying to agree that France is holding the door open for the Brits. I think they would much rather that we hadn't left, because I don't think it's very comfortable for France either to be left in an EU with only two major powers. I think they appreciated quite a lot of what we brought to the EU.
While complaining about it.
Well, of course, and we're like siblings. We've always rowed for 1,000 years. But the security relationship, for example, the foreign policy relationship, the active role in the world is something that France will feel quite alone in pursuing in the EU. But yeah, they will be looking for ways of ensuring that they don't have to pay more as the UK leaves the EU, that Paris can win some jobs, that the financial sector, the agriculture sector won't lose. So they want France to win. I don't think they want to punish the UK, and I don't think that Macron will want to drive the UK off a cliff edge. He's a pragmatist, and he will want a settlement, but he wants it to be a tough settlement for the UK, and the most positive possible for Europe.
I mean, from the British point of view, any sign of Barnier, who is French, ganging up with Macron is only going to inflame tensions, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. And having said what Peter Ricketts have just said, I think it will be a very difficult balancing act for both Barnier and indeed Macron. But it will again be driven by national interest and certainly not by compassion for the British. In simple terms, I think the French won't care at all what Theresa May's situation is as regards domestic politics or indeed what her feelings are. They will simply view her as a provably weak British leader whom they can influence to their own advantage. Let's not forget that Emmanuel Macron is a very hard Brexiteer who would want to see Britain out of the single market and out of the customs. He thinks that if Britain wants to go it alone, then it should go it alone, rather than try to fudge its own Brexit process. But we've already seen signs of, France or Paris trying to usurp the City of London's reputation as the leading European banking sector. As head of state, Emmanuel Macron won't get into the finer details of all these policies, but he's already made it clear that there will be a warm welcome for bankers, and not just French ones, to relocate to Paris.
So, I mean, would you agree with that France is likely to be an obstacle if Britain decides to go for a softer Brexit involving a continuing trade relationship?
No, I don't think I do agree. I mean, I think the French will not want a complete disaster at the end of this negotiation. I think it's been obvious for some time that a transitional arrangement is the only way of giving enough time to work through all this detail. And the first rounds of discussion we've had have just been skating over the surface of the first of the problems, like EU citizens' rights, for example, which is already complex enough. There are a whole host of others to be done. So I don't think the French will have a problem with the transitional arrangement. I think the trick will be that they will want that transitional arrangement to be with all the rules of the EU applying. So the European Court of Justice, free movement, and so on. And it's only at the end of that that they would look for some compromise. They wouldn't want a fudgy arrangement where Britain is half in and half out.
But they could
for
go for this
period.
transition.
I think so, because I think it's in their
really
interest.
appeared on the EU side of the negotiations. It's just a British...
Well, I mean, the EU side are sitting pretty comfortable at the moment. They've set out their position. Britain is, frankly, being fairly slow to respond to it in any substantive way. And so they're waiting for the Brits to lay a few more cards on the table. But as time goes on, if the negotiation is developing, I don't think the French will get in the way of a transitional arrangement. They won't want to fudge.
Now, a lot of French people here, what about this whole citizens' rights issue? Again, there's a suggestion now that perhaps the European Union beginning to play hardball and say, well, if you're not going to accept full rights for our citizens in the UK, you won't get them for your citizens abroad, particularly they won't be able to move between EU countries.
Yes, and I think what is at the heart of the matter overall is that what Michel Barnier is seeking is his overriding aim is really convergence. He wants to find out exactly what Britain's out of Brexit, and so that to make sure that it overlaps with a reconstituted EU. And so which is going to be effectively massively difficult because in very simple terms, Brexit means Brexit. So it's a tautology and it's a truism, but it will make negotiations very difficult indeed. And I think one of Barnier's greatest fear is to see all-out deregulation in an increasingly right-wing Britain. And what the last thing he wants to see is a low-tax sweatshop on the margin of Europe.
But perhaps there's a tension there in as much as the European Union's all for regulation, but I thought Macron was elected promising a lot of economic deregulation.
Well, economic reform anyway. He wants to reform the labour market and get that working. That's the price for the Germans to work with the French on EU solidarity and the Eurozone and so on. But no, he's still a French leader, and I think he will not want to unpick the social protections that France has. Clearly they don't want to have a kind of Singapore anchored off the coast of Europe, and they'll be careful about that. I think by going for citizens' rights as one of the first in the negotiation, and it was bound to be an extremely difficult subject because that every single case is different, immigration, nationality law and so on, is one of the most complex areas. So inevitably, the more people have talked, the more the problems and the difficulties have come out.
And just how powerful is Macron at the moment? I'm seeing French headlines basically saying the honeymoon's over, the head of the army's resigned over cuts.
Well, as head of, he certainly is built as one of the most powerful head of state in the world, and he certainly is one of the most powerful in Europe. But as you say, he'll have to show some pragmatism when it comes to reforms at home and indeed with the rest of the world. But I think, as far as the relationship with the UK is concerned, I think it has been a generally very good one, and it will remain a strong one. The Entente Cordiale is still very strong, and Macron is a French leader who sees himself as getting on with just everyone. We've seen him getting on with Donald Trump or other unsavory characters such as Benjamin Netanyahu. So it would be hard to see him fall out with British Tories, for example. Yeah.
No, he's a friend of the UK, and I know him quite well, and he knows the importance of us in the defence area, for example. But I'm afraid the way that this sacking of his Chief of Defence Staff has gone was an error. And I think he needs now to be careful that huge power he has doesn't spill over into too much behaviour like we've seen this week.
OK, thank you both very much indeed. This is All Out Politics.